So this presentation is a description of the approach we've taken to validating the CASPAR approach, which we thought would be a good thing to do because it's very easy to claim to be doing good things for digital preservation, but it's harder to collect evidence. So we proposed a number of ways of, a number of types of evidence to present, and we believe that any project that is doing things about digital preservation should be able to use the same metrics to provide this sort of evidence. And in fact, I would say that if a project cannot produce this sort of evidence in a convincing way, then you should have nothing to do with it. So the metrics that we proposed covered a very wide range of materials. The first group of metrics was to demonstrate what we would call a sound theoretical basis for the approach taken. In other words, it should not be just something we happen to think of. It should be based on the mainstream thinking of digital preservation, or something which has been peer-reviewed in some ways. So I think that would be a reasonable metric for any project to adopt. The second broad group was to provide practical demonstrations in a sense of accelerated lifetime tests. So this is done in the commercial world for all sorts of pieces of equipment. You just hit the thing a lot of times and show that it survives. So what we have to do is to look at simulating. Of course, we have to simulate these changes. So pretend that time passes. So we're simulating changes in software. In other words, we pretend that some piece of software that we had been using is no longer available. Simulate changes in hardware. So again, something we use for a particular purpose is no longer available. What can we do in its stead? The environment changes. And then also the knowledge base of the designated community. There are separate videos about that in our training packs. That also may change. So all of those will be, can be discussed in terms of test beds, which I'll talk about a little later. A third metric is one that's recently become possible, and that is to show that a repository gains in trustability by using the techniques that are proposed. In other words, there, as I speak, a draft ISO standard on which a certification process can be built has been prepared and is going through the review process. If we can apply those metrics from that standard to the repository before we apply the techniques that are proposed for digital preservation, we have a number of ticks. The hope would be, if we go through those metrics for certification after applying the preservation techniques, then we should get more ticks. So that's a fairly clear test, I think, that any project should be able to do, any project that claims to be doing something good for preservation. We have a couple of metrics here which are maybe a little bit specific to CASPAR. And then we come to a some metrics that are to do with virtualization, which I think is fairly generally agreed to be a good thing for preservation. In other words, you make yourself independent of the layers below in information terms. So we have to look at demonstrating these techniques across a number of disciplines. We have to demonstrate that we can do things for digital rights management, for authenticity, for all the different sorts of PDI, preservation description information components that are needed according to OAIS. So that again, basic compatibility with OAIS is what that metric is trying to get to. And then we, CASPAR and indeed any other project, should show the impact that it's had. So here are 3 metrics in this group. One is to show a contribution to standards. Another is to show that the techniques are being adopted, and to show that there is a better awareness of the problems and the techniques. So in all of these areas, we have tried to show what CASPAR can say, but they've been designed so that almost any other project in digital preservation should be able to provide this sort of evidence. And indeed, this sort of evidence should be demanded from them. So the Clasper approach, which I need to outline very briefly, a lot of it revolves around capturing representation information and representation networks. There's a separate video that deals with OAIS and with representation information and the tools that can be used to capture that. So we, I think, have a lot to say about representation information, about archival information packages, and where to get the material, preservation analyses, and preservation workflows. So all of these will be illustrated in the detailed testbed presentations and videos which are in the training set. So let's look at the evidence after that quick rundown of what the CASPAR approach contains. So the first was OAIS compatibility. If you look at OAIS, what does conformance mean? It means you support the information model, which consists of the representation information, packaging, description, and all of those sorts of things. Yes, we certainly do. We have a lot to say about representation information, archival information, packages, and so forth. The other side of OAIS conformance has to do with the OAIS responsibilities, and there are the list in the standard. We, looking at those, most of them are outside the remit of the project. Most of them are to do with the other activities of the repository. But CASPAR certainly helps with the things like the definition of designated community and with authenticity, and those are 2 key parts of the responsibilities of repositories. So certainly we can say we're OAIS compatible. We have theoretical underpinning, many papers submitted to peer-reviewed journals. There's a separate bibliography of that. And in particular, we've done a lot of work on the role of knowledge management in preservation. Although it must be admitted we don't have a full theoretical treatment of preservation. We have many of the components, and I think we have an idea of how to take that forward. We have some evidence of trustability. We've been looking in detail at existing archives that are either within the CASPAR consortium or very closely related, and it's clear that most of the archives, almost all the archives, do not have adequate representation information. They don't have the logical archival information package which you need, which contains all of the information that needs that is needed for preservation of an object. And both of those aspects will certainly be improved by the use of CASPAR. So I think that almost automatically an archive will have increased trustability by the use of CASPAR. We have, in terms of virtualization, there are separate presentations in this training pack about digital rights and its virtualization and preservation, and also about authenticity and provenance. Although it must be said that we have not really achieved our aims in terms of persistent identifiers. In terms of the impacts of the project on standards, the recent update of OAIS, as I speak, this draft is undergoing review. CASPAR has had significant input in many areas. I'd pick out three, namely authenticity. The treatment has been very much improved. Significant properties which had not been dealt with in OAIS, although within OAIS these are called for various reasons transformational information properties, and it's dealt with in a very coherent way there, and digital rights. So in all of those there are separate presentations in the training packs, and there's documented information about these things. And we've also had significant input to the preparation of the audit and certification standard for digital repositories. We've had impacts on the standards in the commercial world for the Storage Networking Industry Association, some implementations from IBM, and also an industry standard self-contained information retention format, very closely, essentially an implementation of AIPs. But this is at an industry storage level. The evidence of adoption and dissemination are available in the CASPAR deliverables. We have a number of details that are available as I speak, but they'll be added to over time. And the dissemination materials are available on the CASPAR website and related links from that. The bulk of the work has been done in terms of the accelerated lifetime tests, where we've taken, over the period of the project, we've identified data sets, we've identified threats to them, and those data sets are significant data sets. They're complex digital objects that have many components, many things around them that need to be preserved. We've identified some real-life scenarios where there are real threats to changes in hardware, software environment, and the knowledge base of the designated community, and we've run through those to showing where CASPAR can contribute to their preservation despite all these changes. So these are real-world data sets, real-world scenarios, but of course in an accelerated time frame. So what we needed to have presented is evidence that we've allowed these digital objects to be preserved. The downside of this is because we've chosen really complex examples, it's quite a complex story to tell. So for each of them, and you'll see this in the separate videos from each test bed, there's quite a lot of background information to communicate. There's terminology that needs to be understood just to understand the issues. There's a description of the scenario, description of what was done in terms of using the Clasper approach, and then for each of the test beds there'll be conclusions where in many cases, the people responsible for maintaining that digital object will say why they think what's been done or what can be done using the CASPAR approach really does contribute to their confidence about being able to preserve these complex digital objects. So the next group of videos will be about each of these different testbed areas.